The morning of May 19th in the year 1536 began like no other in the heart of London. The sky hung low over the tower, the air heavy and still, as if even the wind refused to bear witness to what was about to unfold. Within those cold stone walls, a queen waited for death. And Boleyn, once radiant with ambition and grace, now stood at the edge of history, her fate sealed by the man she had once loved and crowned. Yet even as the city beyond stirred with rumors and the court prepared to move on, something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would echo across centuries. This is not just the story of Anne Boleyn's last day. It is the story of the silence that followed, the silence of the crowd, the silence of the man who wielded the sword, and the silence of history itself. That morning, every sound seemed to matter: the creak of the wooden scaffold, the soft murmur of prayers, the whisper of fabric as the condemned queen knelt. And then the brief flash of steel, the breathless instant between life and death, and the stillness that would never be forgotten. For centuries, historians have written of Anne's rise and fall, of her charm, her intelligence, and her defiance. Yet few speak of the man who ended her life, Jean Rombaud, the French executioner whose blade changed the course of a kingdom. Who was he? What did he feel as he stood behind her? Was he merely an instrument of justice, or a silent witness to something far greater than himself? His name faded from records soon after that day, as if swallowed by the very silence he left behind. But the shadow he cast remained, stretching far beyond the tower walls. This story is not about villains or heroes. It is about power, mortality, and the human cost of history. It is about how one quiet morning, a single stroke of a sword reshaped faith, politics, and destiny itself. And as we look back nearly 5 centuries later, we must ask, why do we still return to this moment? Why does Anne's story haunt us? And what does the silence of those who stood beside her, her ladies, her guards, her executioner, tell us about the truths history prefers to forget? In this video, we journey back to that fateful morning, tracing not only Anne's final moments, but the echoes left behind by all who played their part. We will explore the calm before the execution, the composure of the queen, the skill and mystery of the swordsman, and the haunting quiet that followed. Together, they form one of the most powerful and enduring scenes in history, a story of dignity, fear, and the enduring weight of silence. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we uncover the fateful day, May 19th, 1536, the execution of Anne Boleyn, the queen who changed England forever, and the forgotten man whose silence shaped history. Stay with us as we step into the Tower of London, feel the chill of that morning, and witness how a single moment became eternal. Before dawn broke over the Tower of London on May 19th, 1536, the air hung heavy with silence. The usual sounds that marked the beginning of a day in the city, the clang of metal, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of guards, seemed to have been swallowed by the weight of what was about to happen. A thin mist clung to the cobblestones, and the chill in the early air bit through the clothing of anyone who stood outside. Within the walls of the tower, an uneasy quiet had settled. Even the ravens that usually called from the turrets seemed subdued, as if they too understood that this morning was unlike any other. The entire fortress, which had seen centuries of triumphs, betrayals, and executions, now waited for a moment that would echo through history. And Boleyn, once the dazzling Queen of England, now lay awake in her chamber, aware that these were her final hours. Her fall had been swift and merciless. Only a few years earlier she had been at the height of her power, the woman for whom King Henry had broken with Rome and torn his kingdom from the Pope's authority. But politics, ambition, and the volatile moods of the king had turned against her. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges that few truly believed, she had been condemned to die. What made this morning so haunting was not only her fate, but the knowledge that she had once stood at the very center of the nation's hope and controversy. Now she was to die, not by the axe as was customary for those of high rank in England, but by the sword, a method the king had granted her as a supposed act of mercy. The swordsman, summoned from Calais, had been chosen for his skill and precision. As the first pale light of morning touched the stone walls, those within the tower began to stir. Guards moved quietly along the corridors, their armor faintly clinking despite their efforts to remain discreet. The lieutenant of the tower, Sir William Kingston, had the solemn duty of ensuring that everything proceeded according to order. He had spent the previous days in Anne's company, observing her remarkable calmness, her moments of prayer, and her flashes of humor that seemed to defy despair. He had written to Thomas Cromwell of her composure, remarking on how she laughed heartily and spoke with a grace that astonished those who saw her. That composure was not the calm of one resigned to fate, but of one who had decided to meet it with dignity. She had faced humiliation, abandonment, and false accusations, but she would not face death without control over herself. In her chamber that morning, and prepared for her final appearance with deliberate care, she wore a simple gown of dark gray damask, with a red underskirt that symbolized both martyrdom and courage. Her long hair, which had been one of her most admired features, was bound up beneath a close-fitting cap. Around her neck she wore a small cross, and in her hands she held a tiny prayer book that she had read from in the days of her imprisonment. Her ladies, who had stayed by her side through the ordeal, tried to hide their tears, but spoke to them with gentleness and even comforted them. She told them not to weep, that she was at peace with what was to come, and that she trusted in God's mercy. To the few who had the courage to look at her directly, she appeared more like a woman preparing for a solemn ceremony than one going to her death. Outside, a wooden platform had been erected on Tower Green, a place set apart within the fortress where only the highest-born were executed. The scaffold was surrounded by guards, officials, and a selected audience. Only a limited number of witnesses were permitted to attend. The king had ordered that the execution be carried out privately, perhaps to avoid the unrest that might come from the public spectacle of killing a former queen. Yet even among this smaller crowd, there was an unmistakable sense of anticipation. Some came out of curiosity, some out of duty, and a few out of pity. Many struggled to believe that the same woman who had once ruled beside the king, whose influence had reshaped the kingdom, now awaited the stroke of a foreign executioner's sword. The morning light grew stronger, but the silence persisted. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the scaffold's boards and the muted whisper of those gathered near. The crowd was tense, not out of excitement, but because of the strangeness of the moment. Executions at the Tower were not new, but this one carried a different weight. Anne's fall represented the collapse of a dream and the ruthless instability of royal favor. Every person present knew that what they were about to witness was not only the death of a woman, but the closing of a chapter in England's turbulent transformation. When Anne finally appeared, escorted by Kingston and her ladies, the murmurs stopped altogether. She moved with a calm grace that astonished everyone. Her small figure, composed and erect, seemed almost luminous against the cold gray of the morning. Her eyes, dark and alert, surveyed the scene without visible fear. She mounted the steps to the scaffold with steady steps, and when she reached the top, she turned to face the audience. There was no bitterness in her expression, no trace of anger toward those who had condemned her. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that demanded respect even from those who had come to see her die. When allowed to speak, and addressed the onlookers with a voice that was clear and unwavering. Her words, recorded by witnesses, were both humble and ambiguous. She declared that she was ready to die and that she would not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. She prayed for the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord, and asked that God preserve him and give him long life. Those who heard her were struck by her restraint. She made no open protest of innocence, no outcry against injustice, though many believed that her measured tone was her final act of defiance. To deny the king's justice publicly would have risked her family's safety and the peace of the realm. By accepting her fate so calmly, she preserved a form of honor that even her enemies could not tarnish. Yet beneath her words, many sensed a hidden meaning, a subtle recognition of the falsehood of her condemnation and the power of faith to outlast royal authority. After her short address, Anne knelt in the center of the scaffold. Her ladies removed her outer garments and placed a blindfold over her eyes. She knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer. The French swordsman, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. He was an unusual presence, his role both essential and strangely detached from the political theater surrounding him. Unlike an English headsman, who used an axe, he carried a long, slender sword, honed to deadly sharpness. He had been chosen precisely because of his reputation for swiftness and accuracy. The king, perhaps out of lingering affection or perhaps to quiet his conscience, had ordered that Anne's death be as merciful as possible. The swordsman's task was to deliver one clean stroke that would end her life instantly. In that suspended moment before he struck, the air seemed to freeze. Those present held their breath. The executioner, as was customary, called out for his assistant to fetch the sword, a signal meant to distract the condemned from the motion of the fatal blow. But in this case, it was a trick of mercy. While he called out, the swordsman already had the weapon in hand. Asin lifted her head slightly, still murmuring her final prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. The sword flashed through the air. It was so quick that few realized what had happened until her body fell forward, and the sound of the blade striking the platform broke the silence. The deed was done in a single motion. Her head was placed carefully beside her body, and a linen cloth was drawn over both. The crowd, stunned by the swiftness of it, remained silent for a long moment. When the silence finally broke, it was not with cheers or noise, but with low murmurs and the shuffling of feet as people began to leave the green. Some crossed themselves. Others wiped their eyes. Even the guards, hardened men who had seen many deaths, looked unsettled. There was no triumph in the air, only a heavy sense of finality. The queen was dead. Within moments, her remains were gathered by her ladies and placed in a simple chest, which served as her coffin. She was buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, only a short distance from where she had fallen. No grand ceremony marked her passing. The woman who had once worn a crown was laid to rest with quiet haste. The swordsman, having completed his grim task, was paid and quickly departed. His part in the story was brief but significant. He was the only man on that green who had no personal interest in the politics of the moment. His duty was to kill, efficiently and cleanly, and he did so without hesitation. In a way, he represented the cold precision of fate itself, impersonal, inevitable, and beyond argument. The crowd, for all their tension and dread, were witnesses not to an act of justice, but to the chilling reality of power. The king's will had been carried out, and nothing more needed to be said. The morning that had begun in silence ended much the same way. The mist lifted, and the sunlight broke through, falling across the tower's stones. London stirred to life beyond the walls, but inside the fortress, an unnatural calm lingered. The execution had been swift, but its echoes would last for generations. The story of Anne Boleyn's death spread quickly through the city and across Europe. Some spoke of her courage, others of her supposed guilt, but few could forget the image of her last moments, the poised woman on the scaffold, the gleaming sword, and the haunting stillness that followed. Her composure in the face of death became one of the most enduring parts of her legacy. Even those who had turned against her could not deny that she had met her end with remarkable courage. There was something unsettling about the way she accepted her fate, as though she had already transcended the worldly court that had condemned her. Her final words, prayerful and ambiguous, carried a quiet power that defied the circumstances. They suggested both forgiveness and awareness, a recognition that truth was beyond human judgment. It was this mixture of serenity and unspoken defiance that made her death resonate so deeply. She had lost everything, her crown, her child's future, her life, but she had kept her dignity. The atmosphere at the tower that day was unlike any other execution that had taken place there. It was not the raucous spectacle that often accompanied the death of traitors or the condemned. There was a sense of solemnity, almost reverence, that set it apart. Even the weather seemed to reflect the mood. The still air, the soft light, and the absence of noise combined to create a feeling that time itself had paused. Those who witnessed it would later recall that they felt as if they were part of something greater than the mere punishment of a fallen queen. They had seen the end of an age, the moment when love, ambition, and power had collided with the brutal machinery of royal authority. The swordsman's role, though brief, has fascinated historians for centuries. His presence at the heart of such a charged scene symbolized the strange intersection of mercy and violence. Unlike the heavy axe that required strength and often left a gruesome result, the French sword was a weapon of speed and elegance. The king's decision to employ a swordsman rather than an English headsman was both practical and symbolic. It suggested a final gesture of respect for a woman he had once loved, yet it also underscored the foreignness of her position, and had been educated in France and carried herself with continental grace. In the end, it was a Frenchman who delivered her death, as if to complete the circle of her life story. As the day wore on, the tower slowly returned to its usual routine. Guards resumed their posts, officials signed documents, and preparations began for the next chapter of the king's life. By the following day, Henry was already making arrangements to marry Jane Seymour. The speed with which he moved on only deepened the sense of tragedy surrounding Anne's death. Her downfall had cleared the path for another queen, and in the eyes of the court, the execution was a matter of political necessity rather than moral consequence. Yet for those who had seen her die, the image of her calm, prayerful figure kneeling before the sword would remain indelible. In the years that followed, the story of that morning grew into legend. Writers, chroniclers, and ordinary people retold it in different forms, each adding their own detail or interpretation. Some described the tower as shrouded in a strange stillness, as if nature itself mourned her passing. Others imagined her ghost walking the grounds, her presence forever bound to the place of her death. But beyond the myth, the historical record remained consistent in one regard. Those who were there agreed that Boleyn faced death with uncommon courage. Her composure stood in stark contrast to the cruelty that had brought her there. It is striking to imagine the crowd's emotions in those final moments. They were not a mob baying for blood, but a subdued assembly caught between disbelief and awe. Many must have wondered how swiftly fortune could turn in Tudor England, where one day a woman could be queen and the next she could be condemned as a traitor. The political forces that destroyed and were vast and impersonal, yet on that scaffold they took a human form. The people saw before them not a symbol but a person, a woman young, graceful, and tragically doomed. The mixture of fear, pity, and respect that filled the air was unlike anything that could be captured in written record. It was the kind of emotion that lingers unspoken, carried in memory long after the scene itself has faded. Even after her burial, the quietness around the tower remained. The place where she died seemed to hold that silence, as if the earth itself had absorbed it. Over the centuries, visitors have remarked on the peculiar stillness of Tower Green, a place where the noise of the city seems to dim. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps something of that morning remains. The memory of Boleyn's final moments, her measured words, and the swift flash of the sword continue to haunt that ground. The execution that was meant to erase her instead gave her an immortal presence in history. The fateful day of May 19th, 1536, began in stillness and ended in silence. Yet between those two moments lay an event that changed England forever. The quiet before dawn was not just the calm of nature, but the breathless pause before the fall of a great figure. Anne's composure, her restrained yet powerful last words, and the extraordinary stillness of the crowd all contributed to an atmosphere that felt suspended between life and legend. The swordsman's clean, efficient act marked the end of her life, but also the beginning of her enduring story. In that fleeting instant, the fragile line between power and ruin, between love and death, became visible to all who stood there. No one who witnessed it could have doubted the significance of what they saw. They had watched the passing of a queen, the fulfillment of a king's ruthless will, and the triumph of silence over accusation. The Tower of London, with its cold walls and long memory, had absorbed another tragedy into its stones. The stillness that morning was not the emptiness of fear, but the quiet weight of history being written in blood. And though centuries have passed, that dawn remains one of the most haunting in England's story. A morning when the world seemed to hold its breath as a woman met her fate with grace that no sword could destroy. Jean Rombaud, the French executioner summoned to end the life of Boleyn, stood as a shadowed figure in one of history's most haunting mornings. His name would never be as famous as the Queen's, yet his presence was crucial to the story that unfolded on that cold morning at the Tower of London. He was not an ordinary executioner. He was a swordsman by training, known across France for his precision and speed. His weapon was not the heavy axe that English headsmen used, but a finely balanced sword, sharp enough to deliver a clean strike in one motion. This difference was not just a matter of skill, but of meaning. The axe was a symbol of public punishment, a tool of fear. The sword, in contrast, was a weapon of honor, often associated with soldiers, knights, and duels. To die by the sword was, in a sense, a more refined and merciful death. It was for this reason that King Henry had summoned Rombaud from Calais, seeking an execution that would be remembered not for its brutality, but for its swiftness. Yet beneath that gesture of supposed mercy lay the chilling truth. A queen would still die, and Rombaud's blade would carry the burden of that act forever. When the order reached Calais, Rombaud was already known among his peers as a man of calm nerves and flawless timing. He was skilled not only in the physical act of execution, but in the discipline of emotional control. In his work, hesitation or pity could mean disaster. The executioner's art demanded both precision and detachment, for to falter in either could turn a clean death into a public horror. The message that reached him carried little detail. He was to travel in secrecy to England, where his services were required for a matter of great importance. He was told that he would be executing a woman of the highest rank, but her name was not written in the summons. Such secrecy was deliberate. The English court wanted no rumors, no forewarning that might unsettle the people or reach the ears of those sympathetic to the condemned. Rombaud understood this well. In his profession, silence was as vital as the sharpness of his blade. The journey from Calais to London was short in distance, but heavy in weight. As Rombaud crossed the Channel, he carried with him more than his weapon and his skill. He carried the invisible burden of history waiting to be made. The crossing itself was uneventful, but his thoughts were not. The sea that morning was calm, gray, and endless, a mirror to the stillness he would later witness within the tower walls. He traveled under discreet escort, speaking little to the men who accompanied him. They were instructed to keep his identity hidden and to avoid drawing attention. The king's court wanted no speculation, for whispers about a foreign swordsman arriving in England could have stirred curiosity and fear. Every step of the journey was carefully managed. Even upon arrival, he was taken not through the crowded streets of London, but by quiet routes that led directly to the tower. It was as if the city itself was blind to his presence, unaware that within its walls, a moment of irreversible consequence was approaching. When he arrived at the tower, Rombaud was greeted by the lieutenant, Sir William Kingston. The Englishman treated him with courtesy but little warmth. Theirs was a professional exchange, not a personal one. Kingston explained the details of the execution, where the scaffold would stand, who would be present, and how the ceremony would proceed. The Frenchman listened carefully, asking only practical questions about the height of the platform and the positioning of the condemned. His concern was for precision, not ceremony. He inspected the site quietly, testing the firmness of the boards, measuring the space he would need to swing his blade. He moved with the composed air of a man accustomed to routine, but inside, he must have felt the strange tension that came with his task. Executions were his trade, but this was no ordinary commission. He was about to kill a crowned queen, the wife of one of the most powerful monarchs in the world. Rombaud's sword had been carefully prepared for the journey. It was of fine steel, made to his own specification, long and slightly curved toward the tip. Its weight was perfectly balanced, allowing for a single sweeping motion that required both strength and precision. Unlike the axe, which depended on brute force, the sword demanded finesse. He had spent years perfecting the technique, practicing on dummies and condemned men alike, until he could strike without hesitation. His skill had earned him both fear and respect in Calais, where he was regarded as a craftsman of death rather than a butcher. To Rombaud, the act was not driven by cruelty, but by duty. He saw himself as a servant of justice, though justice, in his world, was defined by kings and courts rather than truth. In the quiet of his temporary quarters within the tower, he waited for the appointed morning. It was there, perhaps, that he allowed himself to think about the woman whose life he would soon take. He knew little of her, only that she had once been beloved of her king and now stood accused of betrayal. The English soldiers who guarded him spoke of her in hushed tones, sometimes with pity, sometimes with scorn. Rombaud did not ask for more. He preferred not to know too much about his subjects. To learn their stories, to imagine their lives, would only make his work harder. Distance was a necessary armor. Yet even so, he could not entirely ignore the gravity of the situation. The very secrecy that surrounded the event told him how extraordinary it was. Never before had he been called to execute a queen. The night before the execution, the tower was unnaturally quiet. Rombaud sharpened his sword by candlelight, the rhythmic sound of steel against stone filling the small chamber. Each stroke was deliberate, steady, and unhurried. The blade caught the light with a cold gleam. When he was satisfied with its edge, he cleaned it carefully, wiping away every trace of dust. Then he laid it down beside him and sat in silence. For most men, that stillness would have been unbearable, but for Rombaud it was necessary. He needed his mind clear of all distraction. In his profession, emotion was the enemy of precision. To strike truly, he had to feel nothing. When the first light of dawn broke over the tower, Rombaud rose and prepared himself without ceremony. He dressed in dark clothes and carried his sword with the same ease that a musician might carry his instrument. As he stepped outside, he could sense the weight of the day even before he reached the green. The air was cold, and a faint mist lingered around the stone walls. The silence was broken only by the soft sound of footsteps and the distant call of a raven. When he reached the scaffold, he saw that everything was ready. The platform stood firm, surrounded by a small group of witnesses, nobles, soldiers, and a few attendants. All eyes turned to him as he took his position. He nodded to Kingston, signaling that he was prepared. From his place, he could see the door through which Boleyn would appear. He waited, motionless, as she was led out, accompanied by her ladies. Even from a distance, her composure was unmistakable. She walked with grace, her head held high, her face calm and pale. When she mounted the steps and stood before the crowd, Rombaud observed her quietly. He had seen many condemned face death, but none had carried themselves quite like her. There was no trembling, no pleading, no outburst. She seemed to accept her fate with a serenity that unsettled even him. In that instant, the line between victim and executioner blurred. Though he held the weapon, it was she who appeared in command of herself. When she finished speaking her final words, Rombaud knew his moment had come. He moved forward slowly, each step deliberate. The sound of his boots on the wooden platform seemed to echo unnaturally in the silence. And knelt, and her ladies stepped back, weeping softly. Rombaud positioned himself behind her, studying the line of her neck. Every movement was part of a ritual he knew well, the calculation of distance, the adjustment of stance, the breath before the strike. He spoke in French to his assistant, using the traditional phrase to distract her. Then, with a single fluid motion, he swung his sword. The strike was clean and precise. There was no second blow, no hesitation. The body fell forward, the head rolled gently aside, and the air filled with the sound of shocked silence. It was done. For a brief moment, Rombaud stood still, sword lowered, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had occurred. Then he stepped back, allowing the attendants to tend to the remains. His face betrayed no emotion, but inside, he must have felt the strange mixture of relief and weight that always followed his work. Relief that the stroke had been true, that there had been no suffering. Weight because he knew that this act would not fade with the morning. He had done his duty, but this duty would follow him long after he left the tower. When it was over, Rombaud cleaned his sword carefully, wiping it with a cloth that was soon stained red. He did this with the same calmness he had shown in every other part of his work. There was no ceremony, no triumph, no remorse visible on his face. He was a professional, and professionals did not linger on emotion. Yet even for a man so skilled in detachment, it is hard to imagine that he could completely erase the image of that morning from his mind. The memory of the kneeling queen, the stillness before the strike, and the quiet shock of the witnesses must have remained with him for the rest of his life. The payment he received was generous by the standards of his trade. The king ensured that he was well compensated and sent back to Calais with secrecy equal to that which had brought him. He left England quietly, without public acknowledgement, his presence barely noted in official records. It was as if he had been a shadow passing through history, called upon only for one task, and then dismissed. Yet that single act defined him forever. In the years that followed, his name was mentioned in whispers, sometimes in admiration of his skill, sometimes in pity for the burden he carried. He had executed many before and perhaps many after, but none of those deaths held the same weight as that of Boleyn. The secrecy surrounding his journey back to France was as tight as it had been on his way to England. He traveled under guard, avoiding attention, and spoke to no one of what had happened. In Calais, he resumed his duties quietly, returning to the routine of his profession. But those who knew him noticed a change. He became more withdrawn, more silent than before. Perhaps it was the memory of that morning, or perhaps it was the awareness that he had played a part, however unwilling, in a moment of immense consequence. An executioner could not choose his victims, yet he could not entirely escape their stories either. To understand Rombaud's place in this history is to see the contrast between the human and the symbolic. To the world, he was merely the instrument of the king's will, a nameless figure who carried out a command. But within that role lay a deeper conflict. He was a craftsman who took pride in his skill, yet his skill existed only for destruction. He was detached, yet he was forever linked to one of the most intimate and haunting acts of his time. Every execution demanded precision, but this one demanded more. It demanded that he perform his duty without falter while knowing that the eyes of history would be upon him. The pressure of that awareness, combined with the silence that surrounded his task, must have pressed heavily on him. In the years that followed Anne's death, England changed rapidly. The king remarried, the court moved on, and new political intrigues replaced the old. Yet the memory of that morning lingered. The story of the Queen's calm composure and the Frenchman's flawless strike became part of the legend that surrounded her. People spoke of how mercifully she died, how swiftly the blade fell. Few thought about the man who held the sword, but without him, that legendary calmness would not have been possible. It was his professionalism, his control, that allowed her to die with dignity. In that sense, Rombaud's detachment became an unspoken form of respect. He gave her the one thing left to give, a quick, clean death. For Rombaud himself, detachment was both shield and curse. To survive in his profession, he had to separate his actions from their consequences. But when one's work involves ending lives, that separation can never be complete. He could perfect his technique, polish his sword, and quiet his thoughts, but the echo of each death remained. In the case of Boleyn, that echo was amplified by her fame, her grace, and the circumstances of her fall. He had been part of a moment that the world would never forget, yet his role was to remain invisible within it. In the quiet of his later years, he may have thought back to that journey across the Channel. The misty morning, the secret orders, the cold platform, the kneeling figure. He might have remembered the feeling of the sword cutting through air, the collective gasp of the witnesses, and the unnatural silence that followed. For all his detachment, he was still a man, and men remember. Perhaps he took comfort in knowing that he had done his work perfectly, that the Queen had felt no pain. Or perhaps he wished that he had never been called to England at all. The unseen shadow that Jean Rombaud cast over history is the shadow of duty carried to its extreme. He was the instrument of power, a man whose identity was swallowed by the act he performed. Yet without him, the story of Boleyn's death would have been different, perhaps slower, perhaps crueler. His professionalism, born from years of discipline, made the unbearable moment bearable, if only by a fraction. The crowd that watched him work saw only a quiet, faceless figure, but in his stillness lay the same silence that had filled the tower before dawn. It was the silence of inevitability, of history moving forward through the hands of those who had no choice but to serve. Rombaud's name faded from common memory, while Anne's became immortal. She was the fallen queen, the tragic symbol of ambition and betrayal. He was the shadow behind her last breath, the final presence in her story. Yet they were bound together in that instant on the scaffold. She in her courage, he in his control. Both played their parts with composure that defied the horror of the act. When he struck, history turned a page, and both of them became part of its indelible script. The silence that followed the fall of his sword was not merely the end of a life, but the beginning of a legend that would never die. The stroke that ended Boleyn's life was so swift that those who stood nearest the scaffold could hardly believe it had happened. In a single movement, the gleam of Jean Rombaud's sword caught the pale morning light, and then silence fell like a shroud over Tower Green. It was the kind of silence that does not simply fill a space but transforms it, holding every person still, as though time itself refused to move forward. The sound of the sword's impact against the air, followed by the soft thud of Anne's body as it fell, remained suspended in the minds of those who witnessed it. For a long moment, there was no reaction, no cry, no murmur, no prayer. The stillness was absolute, broken only when one of Anne's ladies let out a faint sob that echoed across the wooden platform. The swordsman stepped back, lowering his weapon, his face unreadable. The deed was done, and with it, an age in English history had quietly shifted. Anne's ladies moved forward, their hands trembling as they gathered her remains. One of them, unable to contain her grief, knelt beside the lifeless body, whispering prayers through her tears. They had brought with them a small chest, hastily prepared to serve as a coffin. With solemn care, they placed the Queen's body and her severed head inside it. The gesture was one of loyalty and love, the last act of service they could offer to the woman who had once been their mistress. Around them, the small assembly of witnesses began to stir. The nobles, the guards, and the officials shifted uneasily, as though eager to leave but reluctant to be the first to move. The lieutenant of the tower, Sir William Kingston, stepped forward to ensure that the burial would proceed as ordered. He kept his voice low, his expression grave. There was no triumph in his manner, only a weary sense of duty. Everyone there seemed to understand that what they had seen was not simply an execution, but the conclusion of a tragedy that had begun years before, when love, power, and ambition had collided in the court of King Henry. Rombaud remained silent as the attendants finished their task. He watched briefly, then turned away, wiping his sword with a cloth he had brought for that purpose. Each stroke of the cloth was measured, almost ceremonial. When the blade was clean, he sheathed it carefully and handed it to one of the guards who had accompanied him from Calais. He did not speak to anyone, nor did anyone address him directly. His work was finished, and in that moment, he ceased to exist in the eyes of the court. Within minutes, he was led away from the scaffold and escorted from the Tower grounds. The same secrecy that had brought him to London now surrounded his departure. He was paid in private, thanked in few words, and told that his presence in England was no longer required. Before midday, he was on his way back toward the coast, his passage already arranged, his identity hidden once again. For those who had watched him perform his task, Rombaud seemed almost unreal. A figure who had appeared from the shadows, carried out his grim duty with mechanical grace, and vanished without trace. His presence had been as brief as the stroke of his sword, and his absence afterward felt equally strange. There were no public records detailing his return to France, no mention of his reward in official ledgers, and no testimony from those who might have spoken with him after the event. It was as if he had never existed outside that single morning. Historians would later note the gap in his story, the abrupt end to his trace in English records, and the mystery that surrounded him. Some said he died soon after his return to Calais, others that he continued his profession quietly until old age. But in truth, nothing is known for certain. The swordsman's shadow lingered only in the memory of that moment, the echo of his blade resonating through history long after he had gone. The stillness that had settled over the tower did not fade quickly. Even after the Queen's body had been carried away and the scaffold cleared, the air remained heavy. The witnesses departed in silence, some pale, others pensive. The guards who had stood watch found themselves speaking in hushed tones, reluctant to disturb the strange quiet that lingered over the place. Kingston himself recorded the event with simple words, noting her composure and the swiftness of the act. Yet he could not have captured the full sense of unreality that gripped the tower that day. It was as if everyone present knew they had participated in something far larger than themselves, something that would haunt the nation's memory. Outside the tower walls, London continued its daily life, though word of the execution spread quickly. By evening, people in taverns and marketplaces were whispering about the death of the Queen. Some spoke of it with sorrow, others with grim satisfaction. There were those who believed she had brought her fate upon herself, and others who saw her as the victim of a ruthless court. Yet no one could deny that her fall marked a turning point. The same city that had once cheered her coronation now gossiped about her death. The speed with which Henry moved to erase her memory shocked even his closest advisers. Within days, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, as if the execution had cleared the stage for a new act in his reign. The transformation was almost too sudden to be real, and yet it reflected the brutal efficiency with which Tudor power operated. One life had ended, and the machinery of monarchy turned on without pause. Jean Rombaud, traveling back across the Channel, could not have known how deeply the consequences of his work would shape England. The blow he had struck did more than end a life. It closed one chapter of religious and political transformation and opened another. Anne's death confirmed the absolute authority of the king. It was not only a personal victory for Henry, but a declaration that no earthly institution, not even the Church of Rome, could challenge his will. The separation from the Pope, which had begun as a result of Anne's rise, was now irreversible. Her execution sealed the new order. In the eyes of many, she had died not only as a queen but as a symbol of the movement that had divided the nation. The Reformation in England had already begun before Anne's fall, but her death gave it a new and darker tone. Those who had supported the break from Rome saw in her fate a warning of how dangerous it could be to stand too close to power. Reformers who had once celebrated her as a Protestant heroine now kept silent, fearing that the same fate might await them if they displeased the king. At the same time, her enemies in the old church viewed her death as divine justice, proof that God had punished her for her part in the nation's schism. Yet even among them, there was unease. The manner of her execution, the secrecy, the haste, the almost clinical efficiency, suggested that something more than justice had been done. It was not a trial of faith or morality, but a show of authority. The king had made it clear that loyalty, not conscience, would decide who lived and who died. Rombaud's part in this greater story was brief but essential. His sword, honed for precision, became the instrument through which a monarch's will was enacted. The single stroke that ended Anne's life was also the stroke that completed Henry's transformation from reformer to absolute ruler. In that moment, the balance of power in England shifted irrevocably. Parliament, the church, and the nobility all understood that the crown's authority could reach anyone, regardless of title or past favor. The image of Anne's headless body on the scaffold served as a silent warning that even the highest could fall without appeal. The silence that followed the execution was not only grief, it was fear. It was the realization that words, love, and loyalty offered no protection against the king's wrath. In the days that followed, the tower's chaplains held a quiet burial for, and in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. There were no mourners beyond her ladies and a few guards. The ceremony was simple and swift, conducted with the same restraint that had marked every part of her downfall. Yet even in that small act, the sense of finality was overwhelming. A queen had been buried within the same walls that had witnessed her coronation feast only 3 years earlier. The contrast was staggering. Where music and celebration had once filled the air, now there was only the faint murmur of prayers and the dull scrape of shovels on stone. While London moved on, the ripple of her death spread through Europe. Ambassadors wrote to their kings and queens describing the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. In France, wherein had once lived as a young woman, the news was received with shock. Many at the French court had admired her charm and intelligence, and they spoke quietly of the cruelty of her fate. In Rome, the papal court took grim satisfaction in her fall, seeing it as divine retribution for Henry's defiance. Across the continent, her execution was discussed not merely as a scandal of love and betrayal, but as an event that defined the new order of European politics. It was a warning that England had fully broken from the authority of the Pope and that its king now ruled by his own law alone. Jean Rombaud, by then, had already disappeared back into his obscurity. He may have returned to his duties in Calais, or perhaps retired from his trade altogether. The truth remains lost to time. Yet even in his absence, his act continued to echo. The perfection of his strike, the clean precision of it, became a kind of legend. English chroniclers wrote that the Queen died swiftly and without pain, a detail that both comforted and disturbed readers. Comforted because it suggested mercy, disturbed because it showed how efficiently a life could be erased. Rombaud's professionalism became part of the myth, the invisible thread connecting the moment of her death to the larger transformation of the realm. As months turned into years, Anne's memory refused to fade. The king might have hoped that her name would vanish, but it lived on in whispers, poems, and the private prayers of those who had once loved her. The child she left behind, Elizabeth, would one day rise to become the very embodiment of the England her mother had helped shape. The same faith and independence that had defined and would resurface in her daughter, whose reign would bring the country to greatness. The irony of history is that the execution meant to erase her from memory instead ensured that she would never be forgotten. The echo of that single stroke continued through the decades, shaping the destiny of the nation in ways neither the king nor his executioner could have foreseen. If Rombaud ever thought of that morning again, it must have been with a mix of pride and unease. For a man of his craft, to perform such an act flawlessly was the highest test of skill. Yet to know that the act had altered the course of a kingdom was a burden no craftsman could have wished for. He had been a servant of justice in name, but justice, in that case, had little to do with truth. He had fulfilled his duty with perfection, yet the perfection itself was what made it haunting. The memory of that single moment, his hand steady, his blade flashing, the sudden stillness that followed, would have been impossible to erase. He had killed not a criminal but a queen, and in doing so, had left a mark on history deeper than any monument. The silence that followed the execution seemed to linger over England for years. It was not the silence of peace, but of a nation holding its breath. The religious turmoil that Anne's life had helped ignite now intensified. Monasteries were dissolved, churches stripped of their relics, and those who resisted the new order were silenced by the same authority that had condemned her. Henry's rule grew more absolute, and his court more fearful. The lesson of Anne's fall was clear. The favor of the king was as fleeting as the breath of morning, and his anger as final as the stroke of a sword. Even those closest to him, including his new queen, must have felt the shadow of the scaffold in their hearts. In time, Anne's death became more than a story of one woman's downfall. It became a mirror reflecting the nature of power itself. Her execution revealed the fragility of human ambition and the dangers of a world ruled by absolute authority. The image of her calmness on the scaffold, the foreign swordsman's precision, and the eerie quiet that followed became symbols of how grace and cruelty can coexist within the same moment. The Tower of London, with its ancient stones and its long memory, absorbed the silence of that morning and carried it forward through centuries. Even now, visitors speak of the stillness that lingers on Tower Green, as if the air itself remembers the sound of that single stroke. Rombaud's unseen shadow remains part of that silence. Though his name is rarely spoken, his act endures. The clean efficiency of his blade marked the point where one era ended and another began. He did not stay to see the consequences, yet he was the hand that set them in motion. The death of Boleyn shaped England's soul, defining its path toward independence, reformation, and the complex relationship between faith and power that would last for generations. The echo of that morning reached far beyond the Tower, beyond the city, beyond even the shores of England. It became a soundless tremor in the fabric of history, a reminder that every act, no matter how brief, can ripple through time in ways unseen. As years passed, the stories surrounding that day blurred into legend. The swordsman from Calais became a ghostly figure in English memory, his name half forgotten, his presence reduced to a shadow that moved silently across the stage of history. Yet his role, though hidden, was irreplaceable. Without his steady hand, the death of the Queen might have been slower, messier, less symbolic. The precision of his act gave her death its eerie dignity, allowing it to stand as a moment of both horror and grace. His detachment, so vital to his task, became part of the atmosphere of that day. The strange calm that enveloped the Tower, the surreal silence that followed the stroke, the lingering sense that something vast and irreversible had just occurred. The echo of that single motion was not just the sound of a sword slicing through air, but the sound of a nation reshaping itself. It was the sound of power asserting itself over faith, of love turning into loss, of history pivoting in one breathless instant. Rombaud vanished, but his act remained, reverberating through every corner of English life that followed. The quiet that settled after the strike was not the end of noise, but the beginning of memory, a silence that carried forward through the centuries, where even today, one can still sense its weight upon the stones of the Tower and in the pages of the nation's story. When Jean Rombaud returned to France after the execution of Boleyn, the world he re-entered was outwardly unchanged, yet the silence that had followed his final act in England likely clung to him. The sea crossing from Dover to Calais must have felt both short and endless. The same gray waters that had carried him toward destiny now carried him away from it, yet he could not have escaped the weight of what he had done. For a man of his craft, the act itself had been perfect, clean, swift, merciful. But for the man behind the sword, the memory of that morning was not something that could be wiped away with the same ease as blood from steel. The sound of the blade cutting through air, the sight of the kneeling woman, and the unnatural stillness that followed would have lived on in his mind long after he stepped onto French soil. He returned not as a hero, nor as a villain, but as a man who had served his purpose and was meant to fade. His journey back into anonymity began the moment he left the Tower gates. The English court made no announcement, no gesture of thanks, and no record of his name beyond a few brief mentions in private correspondence. He was paid discreetly, escorted to his ship, and sent home under orders of silence. Even the guards who accompanied him were instructed not to speak of him. For the king, Rombaud was merely an instrument, a means to an end, and instruments are not remembered. Yet for Rombaud himself, the absence of recognition may have been both a relief and a torment. Executioners in that age were already creatures of shadows. They existed in every city and every province, but their lives were rarely recorded beyond the duties they performed. In France, as in most of Europe, executioners lived apart from ordinary citizens. Their profession was necessary, but their presence was seen as tainted. They dealt with death too directly, and their work, though legal, was associated with sin and impurity. Often they were required to live on the outskirts of towns, their houses marked by silence, their families shunned in markets and churches. The paradox of their existence was that they upheld the law but lived beyond its comfort. Rombaud, despite his skill and renown, would have been no exception. He may have resumed his place among those silent men whose names history preferred to forget, returning to a craft that demanded precision but denied humanity. In the weeks that followed his return, he likely continued his work, carrying out sentences for the governor of Calais or nearby provinces. But within him, something must have changed. Most of his past executions had been of criminals, thieves, traitors, soldiers condemned for desertion. Their deaths, though grim, carried the dull regularity of duty. The execution of a queen, however, was another matter entirely. It was not the act of justice he had once believed his profession to serve, but a command of power cloaked in legality. The weight of that realization, even for a man trained in detachment, could not have been light. He had delivered death to a woman whose name was known across Europe, a woman whose face had graced courts and whose words had influenced kings. To end her life with such clinical precision was both his triumph and his curse. Perhaps he tried to bury the memory in the only way he knew, through work. Each new assignment would have demanded his full concentration, leaving little room for reflection. Yet no matter how many sentences he carried out, that morning at the tower must have lingered. The calm of Boleyn, the faint tremor in her final words, the way her head had fallen perfectly still, all of it must have replayed in the quiet hours of night when even an executioner could not escape thought. He had seen countless men die, some screaming, some silent, some fighting against the inevitable. But her composure had been unlike anything he had witnessed. It had given the act a kind of holiness that no sword could extinguish. That memory, more than the act itself, was what likely haunted him. In those days, few executioners left written accounts of their lives. Literacy among them was uncommon, and even those who could write seldom dared to record their thoughts. To put their experiences on paper was to risk condemnation from both the church and the law. Their silence, therefore, was not just personal but cultural, a silence imposed by society itself. In France, executioners passed their trade from father to son, maintaining their distance from ordinary people. Their records were kept not in words but in memory, a hidden lineage of skill and secrecy. Rombaud's name might have been spoken among his fellow executioners, perhaps with respect for the perfection of his strike, or with awe for the enormity of his task. Yet even among his own kind, such a deed would have set him apart. The more one considers the absence of detail about his later life, the more deliberate that absence seems. It is as though history chose to turn away from him, unwilling to look too closely at the man who had ended a queen. The chroniclers of the time, who recorded every movement of monarchs and ministers, offered no more than a passing note of a swordsman from Calais. Perhaps they feared to humanize him, for to do so would have forced them to confront the humanity of the act itself. It was easier to imagine the execution as a moment of divine justice or royal necessity than as the work of a living man with a conscience. Rombaud thus became both present and absent, visible at the center of one of history's most famous deaths, yet erased from every page that followed. If he ever spoke of it, he might have done so only in whispers, perhaps to a fellow executioner or to a wife who already lived in the shadow of his profession. But what could he have said? That the queen had died bravely? That he had felt the world pause as his sword fell? That he had known in that instant that he was part of something greater and darker than any man should be? Words, for a man like Rombaud, were useless against the memory of that silence. So he may have chosen what many in his trade did, to say nothing, to let the years bury the sound of that stroke beneath the weight of routine and age. As the seasons passed, he might have found his hands trembling when he sharpened his sword, not from fear but from the creeping memory that refused to dull. The work continued, but the man within may have grown distant. Each execution afterward could have carried an echo of that morning at the tower, each condemned face a faint reminder of the calm, dark eyes of the woman he had beheaded. The mind can separate duty from feeling for only so long before the two bleed together. It is not difficult to imagine him pausing between strikes, perhaps staring at the reflection of his own face on the blade and wondering whether the line between justice and murder had ever truly existed. The sparse records of executioners from that era reveal a pattern of silence, so deep it feels intentional. Their names appear briefly in official documents, warrants, payments, legal accounts, and then vanish again. They were men who carried out sentences and disappeared before the crowd dispersed. No one cared to preserve their thoughts, and they themselves were often eager to remain unseen. Their lives were practical and secretive, their deaths unmarked. When one executioner died, another replaced him, inheriting not only his tools but his isolation. It is likely that Rombaud followed the same path. He might have trained an apprentice, passed down his sword, and faded quietly into obscurity, his story reduced to a whisper among those who followed in his trade. Yet to erase a man's name does not erase his shadow. Every execution he performed afterward would have been shaped, consciously or not, by that morning in England. He had looked directly into the face of history and seen its cruelty. That knowledge changes a man. Perhaps he became gentler with his victims, offering them the small mercies of a steady hand and a quick death. Perhaps he prayed before each act, something he had not done before. Or perhaps he withdrew into a kind of numbness, seeing himself only as the instrument he was told to be. In any case, the life that followed must have been lived in the quiet company of ghosts. If he ever stood before a church, he might have hesitated before entering, uncertain whether the doors were open to men of his kind. The church tolerated executioners because the law required them, but it rarely welcomed them. Priests would sometimes bless their tools from a distance, avoiding touch. People crossed themselves when passing their houses. They were men who cleansed society through blood, but were themselves considered unclean. For Rombaud, this isolation would have been intensified by the magnitude of his past. To the world, Anne Boleyn had been a queen, a wife, and a mother. To him, she was the memory of a moment that defined his existence. How could a man who had ended such a life ever feel ordinary again? There is a strange kind of loneliness in being the hand that fulfills history's darkest commands. One does not choose the burden, one merely carries it. Rombaud's silence, then, may not have been simply imposed by society. It may have been his own choice. To speak of what he had done would have been to relive it, to awaken the sound of that morning in the tower when the world held its breath. Silence became a refuge, the only form of forgiveness he could grant himself. Over time, his story may have dissolved into rumor. Some might have said he retired and lived quietly in a small town near Calais, tending a garden and keeping to himself. Others might have imagined that he took his own life, unable to bear the memory. Still others might have believed that he continued to serve the crown of France, his skill too valuable to relinquish. The truth, like so many truths of that era, was lost in the shadows between rumor and record. What remains certain is that no document ever again mentioned his name. The man who had once stood at the center of England's most infamous execution vanished as completely as if swallowed by the mist that had hung over the tower that morning. And yet, history does not forget even those it refuses to record. The absence of Rombaud's story became part of the story itself. His disappearance reflected not only the secrecy of his profession, but the collective desire of society to distance itself from the act he had performed. The world needed Anne's death to be remembered as fate, not as an act carried out by human hands. By erasing the man, the event became myth. Rombaud's silence thus served the same purpose as his sword. It completed the ritual. It is possible, though unprovable, that he lived long enough to hear of the future that his act helped create. Perhaps he heard of the child and had left behind, Elizabeth, and how she had grown into a woman of formidable will. Perhaps he heard that she had become queen, and that under her rule England had flourished. If so, he might have felt something impossible to name, a strange sense of balance, as though the life he had taken had returned in another form. Or perhaps he never knew, and perhaps it was better that way. For a man who had already seen the weight of power up close, knowing how history had turned might have been both a comfort and a punishment. His story, though unwritten, offers a mirror to the nature of history itself. Great events are remembered through the names of kings and queens, yet they are carried out by unseen hands. The power that orders the stroke and the hand that delivers it are bound together, but only one is remembered. Rombaud's life after the execution reminds us that history often silences those who stand too close to its edges. His disappearance was not an accident, but a reflection of the uncomfortable truth that the making of history requires the forgetting of men like him. If he ever walked by the sea in his later years, he might have felt again the salt air that had surrounded his journey to and from England. The wind, indifferent and endless, might have reminded him of the silence that had followed the fall of his sword. The sound of the waves, rising and falling, might have echoed the rhythm of memory, one moment of stillness returning again and again in his mind. And as he grew older, that single act, once performed with perfect control, may have become the axis upon which his entire life turned. The burden of executioners is not only in what they do, but in what they must live with afterward. Each death becomes a shadow, and every shadow lengthens with time. For Rombaud, the shadow of Anne Boleyn was unlike any other. It was vast and inescapable, reaching far beyond the walls of Calais, beyond France, beyond his own life. Whether he found peace or not, that shadow followed him into obscurity, ensuring that even in anonymity, he remained tied to one of the most famous deaths in history. His silence, in the end, speaks louder than any words he might have left behind. It tells of a man who understood that some acts cannot be justified, only endured. It tells of a world that prefers to remember the moment, but not the man. And it tells of how a single morning, a single swing of a sword, can define a life so completely that nothing before or after can exist apart from it. Jean Rombaud's life beyond the block remains a mystery, not because history failed to record it, but because it chose not to. Yet in that deliberate silence lies his legacy. a quiet testament to the unseen burden carried by those who stand at the edge of history, where duty and conscience meet, and where every act, however precise, leaves an echo that time can never erase. The silence that followed in Boleyn's death did not end with her burial. It stretched through generations, lingering in the corners of history, in the quiet between words written by those who sought to explain her fall and those who tried to erase it. Her story became one of the most retold and reshaped tales of the English monarchy, an account revisited by chroniclers, poets, and playwrights who searched for meaning in the rise and ruin of a queen. Yet beneath the countless retellings of her courage and tragedy lies a second silence, a deeper and more persistent one. The silence of those who stood beside her story but did not own it. Among them was Jean Rombaud, the man who, for a brief moment, became the axis upon which history turned, and who then vanished into the shadows of his profession and his century. It is this duality, the loud remembrance of the queen and the quiet forgetting of her executioner, that captures the enduring fascination of that fateful day. Centuries after Anne's death, people still visit the Tower of London, standing on the spot where she met her end, imagining the scene as if it happened yesterday. They picture her serene face, the French swordsman poised with perfect control, the still morning air that seemed to hold its breath before the blow. The human mind seeks meaning in such moments, trying to make sense of the intersection of love, betrayal, and power. Yet while Anne's story survives through words and symbols, Rombaud's remains buried under them. He is remembered not for who he was, but for what he did, a name attached to an act, a shadow moving behind the brilliance of a single morning. The fascination within Boleyn endures because her life embodies contradiction. She was both victim and victor, sinner and saint, destroyer and creator. Her fall became the cost of change, and her death symbolized both the cruelty of power and the birth of something new. People return to her story because it speaks to the timeless struggle between human passion and political ambition, between individual conscience and the forces that crush it. Yet, as history turns her into a symbol, the real woman fades. What remains is not in the person, but in the idea, reshaped to suit the needs of each age. The executioner, by contrast, cannot be turned into a symbol so easily. His story offers no lesson of romance or faith, no moral triumph, only the unsettling reminder that every great story depends upon someone willing to perform its darkest act. To dwell on Rombaud is to confront the parts of history that most would rather overlook. His role forces us to recognize that even in moments of grandeur or tragedy, there are those whose lives are consumed by duty and then forgotten. It is easy to celebrate kings and queens, to write of their loves, their wars, and their words. It is much harder to face the reality of the hands that carried out their orders. The builders, the servants, the soldiers, the executioners, without whom history could not have taken shape. These are the people who leave no records because they were never meant to. Their silence is not accidental. It is structural. History has long been written by those who stand at the top, who had the power to record their own voices, while the rest have been reduced to faint traces, if they appear at all. The enduring silence that surrounds Rombaud's life after the execution is not merely a matter of lost documents. It is part of a deliberate forgetting, an act of collective will. Societies often choose what to remember and what to erase in order to preserve a sense of order. Remembering the Queen allows for reflection on love, betrayal, and divine justice. Remembering the executioner forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that justice and cruelty often share the same face. His disappearance allows history to maintain its distance from the act of killing, to transform death into symbol rather than deed. It is easier to remember the grace of Anne's composure than the moment of violence that ended it. Yet by looking into that silence, by asking who Rombaud was and what became of him, we can begin to see history differently, not as a collection of events shaped only by great figures, but as a network of lives, each bearing part of the weight of the past. The fascination within Boleyn persists because she embodies the allure of the known tragedy. But Rombaud, in his obscurity, offers something else, the lesson of the untold. His story, or rather the absence of it, reveals how history depends on forgetting just as much as on remembering. For every celebrated life, there are countless others that history has rendered invisible. If we consider how easily Rombaud vanished, we are forced to question how many other figures, equally essential to the making of history, have been lost to silence. The builders of palaces, the scribes of decrees, the sailors who carried kings across seas, the nameless soldiers who died in fields whose names no one recalls. Each contributed to the story of civilization, yet their voices are gone. This imbalance is not simply a result of time. It reflects the way societies decide whose stories matter. Power preserves itself through memory, and what it cannot use, it lets fade. To study history with honesty, then, is to listen for the silences as much as for the speeches. In the case of Boleyn, the contrast between remembrance and oblivion is particularly striking. The Queen's image survives in portraits and letters, in ballads and chronicles. Her every gesture, word, and glance have been studied, debated, and romanticized. But the man who delivered her death left nothing but a name. His anonymity protects the story from collapsing under its own weight. To remember him fully would be to admit that history's beauty is built on brutality, that the very moments we admire often depend on acts of human violence. The fascination with Anne's fate, then, is inseparable from the silence around her executioner. One could not exist without the other. Her story endures because his was erased. This silence carries lessons far beyond the Tower of London. It reminds us that the record of the past is not a mirror of truth, but a landscape shaped by choice. When we tell the story of a nation or a ruler, we are also telling the story of who was allowed to speak and who was not. Every historical silence hides a life, a motive, a voice that could have altered our understanding. The challenge is to recognize those absences and to see in them not emptiness, but meaning. The absence of Rombaud's voice does not make his story less real, it makes it essential. His erasure forces us to confront how history constructs its heroes and its villains, and how often it excludes those who do not fit neatly into either role. For scholars and readers alike, the task of revisiting such silences is not to fill them with fiction, but to acknowledge their presence. We cannot know what Rombaud thought as he left the tower, or how he lived afterward, but we can understand what his silence represents. It is the silence of all those who serve history without owning it, whose lives intersect with greatness only for a moment before being cast aside. To search for them is to resist the temptation to see history as a grand narrative of destiny and to instead see it as a web of human experiences. Some told, some hidden, all interconnected. The fascination within Boleyn continues not only because of who she was, but because her story exposes the fragility of power. Her fall reminds us that no crown, no favor, no beauty can guard against the cruelty of circumstance. Yet the fascination also persists because it allows people to witness the transformation of suffering into meaning. The Queen's death becomes a lesson in faith, endurance, or betrayal, depending on who tells it. In contrast, Rombaud's disappearance offers no comfort, no lesson, no closure. His silence remains a question. What becomes of those who serve history's cruelty but are denied its immortality? That question, left unanswered, challenges every generation to consider what kind of memory it wishes to preserve. The broader implication of such silence is that history, as we inherit it, is incomplete by design. The grand narratives that define nations and eras are often constructed around the few who had the power to record their stories. The rest remain as ghosts in the background. By reimagining Rombaud's life, even in speculation, we confront the uncomfortable truth that every great event has its unseen participants, every triumph its cost in forgotten lives. The executioner becomes a mirror not only to Anne's story, but to the structure of history itself. His invisibility exposes the way the past privileges certain voices and silences others. It asks us to consider whether our understanding of the world might change if we listen differently. To see Rombaud as a mirror to history's grand narratives is to see that the making of power always depends upon those who carry out its commands. He stands as the embodiment of obedience, professionalism, and erasure, a man whose precision gave history one of its defining moments, yet whose identity was deemed unworthy of preservation. His silence reflects our collective need to simplify the past, to turn complex human realities into moral tales. We remember, and for her courage and tragedy. We forget Rombaud because he reminds us of the price of both. Yet, if we are to learn from history, we must face the parts that unsettle us as much as the parts that inspire us. There is a kind of dignity in Rombaud's silence, though. It speaks of the limits of human understanding, of the way truth can exist even without words. His anonymity allows him to represent not just himself, but all those whose lives are consumed by duty. In that sense, he becomes a symbol not of cruelty, but of endurance, a figure who bore the weight of history without seeking recognition. Perhaps that is why his story, though unspoken, continues to haunt the imagination. He reminds us that history's splendor is always accompanied by silence, that behind every crown and every victory lies a world of untold lives. The enduring fascination within Boleyn's fate, therefore, is also a fascination with silence itself, the silence of those who stood near her, the silence that followed her death, and the silence that history continues to maintain. Her story invites endless interpretation, while his invites only speculation. Yet together they form a whole, one visible, one invisible, one celebrated, one erased. To understand one without the other is to misunderstand both. The Queen's death was not only her end, but also the moment when the executioner's silence began. His disappearance completes her legend, just as her legend preserves his shadow. In the centuries that followed, countless writers, historians, and artists tried to capture the meaning of that day. They described the morning light, the stillness of the tower, the calm of the Queen, and the swiftness of the sword. Yet few paused to wonder about the man who held the blade. His silence became the space into which history poured its imagination. That space, empty yet resonant, continues to call out to those who study the past not for its heroes, but for its absences. It reminds us that history is not merely a collection of names, but a conversation between what is said and what is not. In reflecting on Rombaud's story, or rather his lack of one, we come to understand that the study of history is not only about preservation, but also about responsibility. To tell the stories of the powerful without seeking the stories of the forgotten is to accept a distorted view of humanity. Every silence in the record carries an ethical weight. When we ignore it, we allow the structures of power that created it to persist. When we acknowledge it, we begin to see the past in fuller, more human terms. The lesson of Rombaud's silence, then, is not only historical but moral. It teaches us to look beyond the block, beyond the spectacle, beyond the written word, into the quiet spaces where truth hides. The executioner's life, or the absence of its record, mirrors the larger pattern of human history. For every event remembered in grandeur, there are countless acts performed in darkness. The figures who vanish are not lost because they mattered less, but because their existence challenges the comfort of the story. The silence that surrounds them is not empty. It is full of meaning, waiting to be understood. By seeking out those silences, we do not only honor the forgotten, we deepen our understanding of ourselves. We learn that history's greatness is built upon the invisible labor of those who never had the chance to speak. As we look back on that morning at the tower, the image that endures is one of contrasts: the Queen and the swordsman, the word and the silence, the remembered and the erased. Together they form a complete truth, that history, like life, is made of both presence and absence. The fascination within Boleyn's fate persists because it holds within it both the beauty of remembrance and the pain of forgetting. Her calm before death, the precision of the sword, and the quiet that followed have become symbols not only of an era, but of the human condition, the constant tension between memory and oblivion. Jean Rombaud's silence, though unrecorded, continues to echo through the centuries as a lesson in humility. It reminds us that even the smallest acts can shape the course of nations, and that those who perform them often disappear without acknowledgement. His story, when pieced together from fragments and absence, becomes a reflection of history's hidden design. The way it selects, refines, and omits until only certain voices remain. To remember him, even imperfectly, is to push back against that design, to restore a measure of balance to the telling of the past. The Tower of London still stands, its stones heavy with memory. Visitors walk where and once knelt, and some say the air still carries the quiet that followed her death. They come to honor her, to understand her courage, and to feel the weight of that moment. Yet in the stillness of that place, if one listens closely enough, there may be another presence, the faint echo of a man who once raised a sword and then vanished into history's silence. His story may never be known in full, but the lessons of his disappearance endure. They teach us that history is not complete until we seek out the unseen, listen to the unheard, and give voice, however briefly, to those whom time tried to forget. The enduring silence, then, is not an absence of sound, but a presence of truth. It reminds us that every story told carries within it 1,000 stories untold. And Boleyn's fate continues to captivate because it reveals the complexity of power, faith, and love. But Jean Rombaud's silence continues to matter because it reveals the cost of that complexity, the human lives consumed by the making of legend. To look beyond the block, beyond the Queen, beyond the crown, is to understand that history's lessons do not lie only in what is remembered, but but in what remains unsaid. And in that silence, enduring and profound, we find the truest reflection of our shared past. That every name forgotten once carried a heartbeat, and every silence, no matter how deep, holds the echo of a life that once stood at the edge of history.